Welcome on, everyone, to not the 15 and 60. Instead, it is yet another NBA trade, the biggest NBA trade since yesterday. We'll catch up, of course, on some more of the fallout from the Luka deal because we only talked about that right after it happened, and there's been some more reporting that I would love to get into. But first off, Danny, before we get to the terms of this trade, I want to remind everyone watching on YouTube, please subscribe, give us a like or a comment. And then, of course, if you want to listen to our full Luka Doncic analysis, you can subscribe exclusively to Dunc'd On Prime, where we have a 35% off code. We've gotten over 100 signups since yesterday, so that's really exciting. That code is mock deadline 25 to get you 35% off a year membership. All right, let's get to work here. We have a trade.
We do. And De'Aaron Fox is now a San Antonio Spur. The deal, it's a 3-team deal. I'll talk about some of the nuances of it later. But the basic tenets of it, the Spurs are bringing in De'Aaron Fox and Jordan McLaughlin, sending out Tre Jones, Zach Collins, CD Sissoko. They're part of Chicago's 2025 first that could have extended if Chicago retained it this year. San Antonio's own first in 2027. Minnesota's first in 2031. The Charlotte fake first, because Charlotte's not going to make the playoffs this year. And then 3 additional second-round picks, the most notable of which is the Bulls' own 2025 second.
Let's begin from the...
Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. The seconds, I'm sure, will be lost to history very quickly here. But let us begin with this question, because you were the Spurs in the De'Aaron Fox mock deadline that we did. I'm glad we got to it pretty quickly. That was on Wednesday. Again, that's something that is available on Dunc'd On Prime for new listeners. And so, or all listeners, I should say, but people who could become listeners as well. I think the Spurs did here in terms of what they gave up, because I recall you had some trepidation of, all right, is De'Aaron Fox the guy that we really want to go all in for?
So this is a richer return asset cost than I would have given up if I were running the Spurs. The fundamental challenge of kind of where does De'Aaron Fox fit in as the offensive force on a great team, especially when you consider kind of where he is with the Kings and a number of other things. We'll have to see that. And so San Antonio, I would say it's kind of, they gave up 2 full firsts and then 2 partial firsts, but really it's more like 2 and 1 and then the non-first with the Charlotte one. And one of the notable differences is that they didn't give up much. And I'm sure San Antonio prioritized this, which I would not necessarily have done. They prioritized not giving up a ton that's helping them now, or players that are young players that will help them in the future.
Yeah.
So, for example, Keldon Johnson was in the formulation of the deal. He is not in this deal. Zach Collins is instead. Tre Jones is, but Tre Jones is marginalized when you keep Chris Paul and you add De'Aaron Fox. So for San Antonio, they gave up more future assets to retain some of the guys they had. But if we're talking about the general structure, 3-ish first-round picks, but you also get off some negative salary, that's a little richer than I would have done. Not horrendously so, because as we talked about at length when we did that pod was, do they still have enough for another move? And my answer is, I still think they do, even if they might not have like the best package.
No, I think you're correct on that. And part of those new packages could include some of the guys that they weren't willing to give up in this one, right? So, yeah, the only asset they gave up in this that I really think they're going to miss that much is that Minnesota first in 2031 and the Bulls, that second half of the Bulls. But, that one I want to talk about in greater detail, specifically when we get to the Bulls as well. Like, how valuable was that really to San Antonio? We've seen just a lot of circumstances where and I think also for Sacramento, they were willing to take back less from San Antonio because they're also getting Zach LaVine. Like, that's part of this too, right? Like the fact giving up that Bulls pick, that incentivizes the Bulls to do it. Whereas if that were some different pick or some different asset, then Sacramento wouldn't have been able to get Zach LaVine. That was something that was probably really important to them, is to get what another guy back that they've long coveted, or at least Vivek has, and also that will, in theory, allow them to remain competitive with this group, which I think it probably will, as we'll talk more about it in a bit. But that to me, so the Bulls pick as an asset really was like punching way above its weight in this specific deal, in a way that it probably couldn't have in a future deal. And it was, it couldn't possibly be a higher than a top 8 pick. And, the Spurs have other mid-lottery picks, probably their own even this year. So the only asset that I'm just like, ooh, that could be massive, that sticks out to me, is that 2031 Minnesota first. They didn't give up the swap, as you presciently did not, by the way, as mock Spurs GM. So nice work on that. So I feel very comfortable for them with the price that was paid here. And then you also throw in that they're able to get off of the money of Zach Collins, didn't have to take back Kevin Huerter too. That also is pretty solid for them going forward, and it could open some things up for them.
It could open some things up for them. I want to do the on the court because that's more important, and then do the Spurs financials of this, which are fascinating in a couple of different ways. But on the court for De'Aaron Fox, I mean, so Fox comes in, he's the point guard of the present and the point guard of the future. And ideally, he will give San Antonio a transition identity, which is a nice fit with Victor Wembanyama. And you could use, maybe that gives more utility to Jeremy Sohan, and Stephon Castle's already doing that. So you can theoretically have Castle in the mix, and Fox can be more of a kind of a primary initiator than his role with the Kings was a little bit different because of the presence of Domantas Sabonis. Maybe Wembanyama does some of that stuff in time. So I think that there are parts of the Fox Spurs fit that I do really like. However, I have a couple of problems. One is I just don't think of Fox as that great of an offensive player overall, especially the transition stuff has waned over the last couple of years, and he's getting older, getting closer to his late 20s than will be in his early 30s on his next contract. And that's when Wembanyama is probably going to be at his best. And the other part of it is that Fox is not a consistent, not a great shooter, and he's not a consistent, not a great defender. And so you think about not only with the player that he is now, but as a 27-year-old, the player that he will be. And I think that he's a very good player. I think that he is someone who will help the Spurs. But unlike almost any team that we've seen, as great as Victor Wembanyama is now, history tells us that he will be much better 4 or 5 years from now than he is. And so this is not a horrible move. But anyway, and I'm lower on Fox than the consensus, and have been for years. But so it's not a horrible move, but I do worry that they're going to be more committed to this, that they think this is a bigger answer than I feel it is.
One of the reasons that I was I shouldn't say very low, but one of the reasons I had some concern and some skepticism, and one of the reasons that I thought that this was such a fascinating deal, was the two components in terms of the opportunity cost. One is what it costs to acquire De'Aaron Fox, and that for a season and a half of Fox, like it's not useless for the San Antonio Spurs to be better. Maybe they could make the play in this year, and that Hawks pick is looking pretty good with Jalen Johnson out. They could even get a couple of bullets in the lottery in the end, and then next year to have Fox as well is pretty useful. And just to be a better team, sort of quell any angst that Victor Wembanyama might have, since he's so good right now that they haven't been doing enough to build around him. So component one, I think they did fine on that. I don't think they gave up too much. I mean, we can just go through what they still have in the cupboard, right? They have all their own first except 2027, but that doesn't preclude them from trading anything with the Stepien rule, because they have another first in 2027 for Atlanta. So they've got their first in 25, which should be pretty decent. They got Atlanta's first this year. They got the swap with Atlanta in 26. 27, they still have Atlanta's first. Boston, they got a swap in 28. 2030, they can swap with either Dallas or Minnesota. That Dallas pick just got a lot better, I would say, with the events late yesterday evening. And then, of course, they have that swap with the Kings too. And I mean, it is pretty interesting. I wonder how much the Kings valued their own swap. Like, would you have rather not given up the Minnesota pick and given up the Kings swap instead?
No, I would rather bet against Sacramento than bet against Minnesota, even with the losing a pick versus that, especially because Anthony Edwards is a wonderful young player. Like Minnesota, with their troubles, like they're in a better spot than Sacramento is. Like betting against the Kings hasn't been a particularly dangerous gamble over the years.
Yeah. Now Minnesota is out a bunch of picks in the future. Like if Edwards leaves, they could really be in trouble. But they could also do this thing where they trade Anthony Edwards and they prioritize getting back players, and their pick isn't that bad. Yeah, I think pretty hilarious to say this about an organization that at least for now still has Glenn Taylor as the owner. Although given his age, even if he wins this arbitration, you'd have to imagine he won't still be the owner in 2031. And then, but I would still rather bet against the Kings. But the Minnesota pick is at least you do owe it, or you do have it outright. But and then of course they have the other guys that they didn't want to give up in the trade. I mean, I would say Vassell and Castle are the two guys who really would have a lot of value. Sohan is probably more of an eye of the beholder guy. A team might value him at like a late first round or something like that. But he's a young guy. He could break out, certainly. So I think they still kind of have enough. And then this offseason, so that's component one. I think they did fine there. But component two is, well, you still have to pay De'Aaron Fox. And it is, if you look at their books in 26-27, it's very revealing that they basically could either have max cap space or they could have De'Aaron Fox, and presumably De'Aaron Fox is going to need to be extended before then. So they did maybe make that decision, but it also seems like a ton of teams are loading up now for 2026 cap space, and that could end up being a crazy summer. We'll see whether the extension trend continues or not there. But so that's where they're at right now. And then we get into what they end up extending Fox for. Presumably it's for the max. At least they don't have enough cap space now, unless they move something to renegotiate and extend him this offseason. That's one benefit of this trade. So those are the two components. And I think this is okay for San Antonio. I think because there is a chance that they wouldn't have another opportunity like this.
There is. And I would say there's a third component of it. You brought up opportunity cost, and that's where I thought you were going with it, which is however long you are with Fox, you are not pursuing a different player who kind of fills that role. At point guard, how pot committed a team is to that is really variable. You can see teams in different respects there. And so I've long said that San Antonio's number one priority organizationally is to get, I like your phrasing of this, a perimeter superstar. To me, De'Aaron Fox is not a perimeter superstar. And he's very good. He's a perimeter all-star at times, but not a superstar, not that guy. And so having a player like Fox can either stunt that pursuit, or it could augment it if the other team is interested in Fox, but you have to be willing to engage. You have to be looking in that respect. And for now, I don't think San Antonio was going to get that player this year. Remember, I also had San Antonio in the mock deadline, and nothing really happened there for that exact reason, because I was saving the ammunition. So I'm torn on that front, because as you said, and I agree with you, players even this good don't come along that often. And the getting lucky in the lottery, all those sorts of ways, even if you have, it's very hard to move up and get that player. The Luka Doncic trade that the Mavericks made doesn't happen very often. So the one that they made to acquire him in the first place. And so
yes.
It's a fraught place to be as aggressive as I would have been if I were running the Spurs. So I understand it. I'm sympathetic. I understand that I am more of a zealot on this than pretty much anybody.
Did we lose them?
Did you? I hope not. Can you hear me? Okay, let me pop back in. Oh, now Nate, can you hear me now? I can see you now.
Yeah, it was my internet that crapped out. What? Luka Doncic gets traded, and then it's my internet that kills us instead of yours. Sorry, can you repeat what you were saying about finish up there with the Spurs? Sorry about that.
So basically, that it's hard. It's hard to acquire a player as good as De'Aaron Fox is right now, much less a player who is dramatically better. So I acknowledge that I'm more of a zealot on this front than almost everybody is, and a person who took this the way I do would very potentially get burned by it. And so I will acknowledge that San Antonio is more in line with the norm on this than I am, but I want to acknowledge the possibility that committing here leads to a worse overall outcome.
Yeah, I think that is certainly possible. Now, you could also trade Fox again. He might be a player who'd be useful to another team if it's not perfect. But yeah, there is an opportunity cost, particularly because point guard, especially when you have Victor Wembanyama, is such a fertile ground to get that unbelievable offensive player. And the fact that some guys might be worse defensively than De'Aaron Fox, that, like, let's say Trae Young as a perfect example, the fact that they might be worse defensively than Fox maybe doesn't matter as much because you have Victor. Although you can say, hey, like, Fox's defense matters. If we can build a team where he's our worst defender and we got Victor, like, we're just going to be the number one defense every year, and that'll be amazing. That's certainly something that I think could be considered, that while Fox might not be as good offensively as some of the on-ball superstars they could have gotten, he is better defensively. And we'll see how he evolves as a shooter. I don't think he's going to be amazing there. The question, too, is just, where is this next guy going to come from? Is it internal development, just drafting with these picks? Is it trading for another player? As I kind of, maybe you're in more of a situation where you're kind of like cycling through some more like late career type of guys, like maybe a Jimmy Butler who's not an asshole that becomes available, right? Like that sort of thing, where someone who would fit better into their culture and they can just kind of roll through those guys and then go get the next one for not that much. Someone like Butler would be available for not that much, but you can just try to go through that process 2 or 3 times, or you just, again, draft and develop that player in theory. So how good is this Spurs team at this particular moment to you?
I think they're more in the kind of play-in mix than the top 6 mix for me in the West. And Wembanyama can be the defensive foundation in and of himself. But my instinct is that this is not like a top 10 offense. I think it's probably more in the 10 to 20 range is probably where I'm thinking. So right now, as we're recording this, San Antonio, they're actually 14th on defense. They've had this really weirdly terrible January. Actually did some prep on that regarding the Cavs recently, but so I would say they're more like, play in, I think is fair.
So let's say, now that you have Fox in particular, and now that maybe they're going to try a little bit harder to win. And so is it possible maybe they don't fuck around with starting either Castle or Sohan? If they did that, if they went with Fox, Champagny, Vassell, Barnes, and Victor. I mean, Victor's really good. Yes. Victor is a top 10 player right now. Like that to me is a clear top 8 team. If you really get to, and then also the other thing that this does is that you don't really lose any rotation guys other than Trey Jones. And
who you've replaced.
Yeah, who you've replaced, and then so now you've got Chris Paul coming off the bench at backup point guard. Maybe you even have CP and Fox play together a little bit too if you need to. CP's been much more aggressive shooting the 3 this year, and he can guard up a little bit off the ball and be a decent help defender. Like, he still is very good for their on-off numbers. But now you actually have, other than maybe backup center, and maybe you could go Sohan there a little bit, or Charles Bassey's been okay in that role. I don't know if he's like a playoff quality backup center, but you now have a group that, and then maybe you're also can just move Castle into a little bit more of a role that's commensurate with the shooting ability that he's shown. You can put him in certain matchups when you need to defend. Other times, maybe you play CP and Fox together, or so bringing in an all-star level player, which I consider De'Aaron Fox to be, does push everyone down a bit in the pecking order, and they have some guys that can give them enough shooting off the bench to where I think this could be. I think this could maybe be a top 10 offense. I'm not sure about that. I want to see what the transition looks like. Obviously, depends how Victor is shooting it, but Fox and Victor are going to be very difficult to deal with if Victor is hitting his shots because, I mean, maybe, and especially also, I would say if the Spurs don't fuck around with Sohan or Castle and then don't give the opposing center a place to hide. If the opposing center has to guard Wembanyama, and now Fox can get a screen set by Wembanyama, the center has to kind of stick close to Wembanyama in the pick and pop, and then Fox is getting downhill in a jailbreak. That's very, very powerful. So I think these guys could possibly reach the level of a top 10 offense, depending on how they decide to deploy everything. And yeah, this is going to be fascinating because the Spurs, whether with Greg Popovich or Mitch Johnson, yeah, you know, they've done a few things to get better and they got Chris Paul now, but they also have been very much prioritizing player development in the way that they've used guys going back to the Point Sohan experiment last year. How much are they going to actually hit the gas on, really try to win? Maybe that doesn't even happen until next year, potentially. But that's going to be a fascinating question for you. But I think these guys, I'm not precluding that they could actually be like pretty damn good just with this group.
They could be. And I like the offense, how it works, how Mitch Johnson and hopefully eventually Greg Popovich utilize these players will be something key to watch. And how that informs what they do moving forward. Just briefly on their financials, the Spurs do they kind of they're under the cap in terms of their holdover players, but when you add in the picks that they're going to still have, they probably go over. So that means they're looking more like a non-taxpayer mid-level team. And then they don't have that much on the books for 26, 27. Presumably De'Aaron Fox will be on that list. If not, then they're going to have a ton of cap space. But I think they could even, depending on how all this shakes out, they could even retain Fox and have a reasonable amount of money for an addition. I don't think it would be a max slot, but it could be enough to do something. But the more practical way to use that potentially, and I'm just putting a little pin in this, would be trade some of the guys that you have under contract and get a player who's already under contract for that time. So you could maybe get a better player in that circumstance. And instead of trying to squeeze the most you can out of $30 million in cap space, try to get a $40 or $50 million player and you'd be fine.
Yeah, and that if they wanted to bring back Fox in the summer of 2026, like if they moved on from Sohan, they could still have 30 million in cap space. And if they move one of the young guys, then they could get close, at least bring in a significant player. This is a good point actually by B in the comments that being better now helps them get more out of the swaps that they are owed, like the 26 swap with the Hawks. If they're better, it actually now it doesn't like.
I don't think
a couple ways to think about that. Well, I mean, let's say they're if you're giving, you do get more value by giving up the 23rd pick for the 10th pick rather than the 15th pick for the 10th pick. But
really, what
I
you're
don't know
doing,
how much
you're pushing the other team down. You're not as much elevating, and so you do run into a circumstance with the Hawks where you have a bunch of their picks. So taking them down does help you a little bit. And that's the Clippers, OKC, the Swapper Bowl that we've talked about a lot before. I think it's a good thought. I think that in practicality, especially because rookies almost never help your team, like in the stages where that will matter to the Spurs, it's probably not that much of a deal.
Yeah, it's just an interesting note in terms of just what the raw value is going to be. But yeah, I don't know that would have affected my decision making necessarily, but it's an interesting thing to talk about. Let me see if there's any other comments on the Spurs portion of this before. I think actually I'd like to move to Chicago next. Do we think that the Spurs next trade for a backup center? I think they probably want to just stick with Bassey for the rest of the season, see how that goes. And I wouldn't be prioritizing that, particularly not someone who makes $20 million the next 2 years.
Not someone who makes 20 million the next 2 years, but you could theoretically, like you could do an imbalanced trade because the Spurs are still well below the tax for this year. If ownership's willing to pay a little bit more, you could throw, you could even try to fold this into this deal, but you could Jordan McLaughlin or something and get back a guy who makes a whole hell of a lot more than him, who the other team doesn't want to pay. We already saw Drew Eubanks go. We'll talk about that deal, but something in that vein, like a $7-8 million, I don't have one in mind, center who the other team doesn't really care about. You could pull something like that.
Yeah, so last one on the Spurs. Nick says, would you have done this deal as the Spurs GM? You kind of hinted at that, I think, at the beginning, but is that your position? You would not have done it?
I'm probably 55-45 no, but it's so close. Like this is close enough where I'm not going to kill them for it at all.
Yeah, no, I think I would have, in fact, done it. Let's talk about Chicago, because this does kind of factor in with what the Spurs gave up, which was that top 10 protected pick. And they did, of course, move on from Zach LaVine. This is, I would say, the height of Zach LaVine's potential value going forward, because he could get hurt at any time. The Bulls are probably going to, if they hadn't made this move, they were going to have to really tank. I mean, yeah, they should anyway, but which is kind of a concern that maybe now they're going to use this as an excuse to not tank, because like top 10, top 8 is actually like not that hard to keep when you don't really have any talent on the roster and you need some, like the Bulls. Like, I actually think this is a good having this pick almost maybe was a good thing to force them to do what needed to be done anyway. And so as a Bulls fan, I might be concerned that now it's like, oh, well, great. Now we can go and chase the 10th seed again with no repercussions, instead of even Arturas and Michael Reinsdorf and company being like, all right, this would be too crazy even for us to like try to give up this pick this year.
They brought back the hazard to their morals.
So how do you say the Bulls did here?
I think they did well, because Zach LaVine, I know that taking on salary beyond this year in Herter and Collins, so those guys make a combined $36 million for the 25-26 season, and of course they're making a lot of money for this year. That's not great for the Bulls. You take that back, those guys are low end rotation players rather than starters or core pieces. However, you get off of Zach LaVine's contract and all of the risk. Even though LaVine, because of his offensive talent, just overall level of skill, I wasn't as afraid of him tanking his value as like Jeremy Grant. But LaVine owed 43 this year, 46 next year, and a player option for 49 the year after. That, there's a way that turns sour. And from the Bulls' perspective, you mitigate that. I think as you said, sell at the high point in the value relative to this point. I mean, if they had traded him 2 years ago, probably would have been a little different, but we don't need to relitigate that. And so for them, you get off of most of the money here. You get, it's an asset. It's a weird kind of asset, because they could have, you and I both think they like should have retained this pick, by being bad and being comfortable being bad. But so there is that weird kind of like mitigation, but so I still think they did very well.
Yeah, worth noting, by the way, that Zach LaVine, due to his trade bonus, now will be making a little bit more in Sacramento. The trade bonus doesn't apply to his player option season, but it does bump him up to 44.5 this year, 47.5 next year. And yeah, I think for most teams like the Brooklyn Nets, I very much praise them for getting their own picks back, because it gave them some kind of a future. But this is a little bit different of a circumstance, because I think if the Bulls had managed to lose the pick outside of this protection, losing the number 11 overall pick is not the end of the world necessarily. Whereas, and they don't necessarily want to like truly be rebuilding. And so this wasn't preventing them from doing it in the way that having a block of 3 years or more, like say the Hawks, for example, where another team has your pick outright and there's no protection, then there's a lot more value in getting it back than this. So this is, I'm not sure how valuable this is for Chicago for a number of these reasons to get back that pick. Most people would be like, oh, hey, you're always in favor of them getting back their own pick. But yeah, with this protection, I don't know. I don't think there was really that great of because it's really more about the optionality of not having your pick that is then opened up for, say, the Nets to do exactly what they're doing now, which they couldn't have done before. Whereas the options that this opens up for the Bulls, I didn't want them doing anyway. And they probably, if they'd been doing the right thing, they would have just retained this pick regardless.
And it converts only to a single second. So the idea that you could have held it, and it's not like you would have, like Miami would have given up an unprotected pick in the future or something like that. So I agree that the asset is weaker, even though you brought up how it punched above its weight in this negotiation, which is a great point for Chicago, but they did still get an asset. And so they maybe could have gotten a better asset, but they still did get one. They also got off of significant savings. It potentially allows them to reorient, even though you and I are not sure that they actually will. And also, like depending on what iteration they are, like Trey Jones could help them, though my instinct is he plays out the rest of this year and then just goes somewhere else as an unrestricted free agent. But it remains to be seen. But so for Chicago, like this isn't in the A range for me, but I do think it's in the B range just because when a team who isn't good and shouldn't be good makes steps in that direction, I think that is good, even if it's not perfection.
Yeah, they've been wanting to move on from LaVine for a long time just to clean up their books a little bit. And they would say probably, oh, well, that's why we couldn't take back Harrison Barnes from the King and the DeRozan swap this summer. And also there's more. So they've done that now. And there's also more to be done here for Chicago. Now, I think based on what happens the rest of the deadline, that will be a very interesting signal of whether the Bulls are just like, yes, now we're finally free to go after the 10th seed. I mean, it's kind of funny. It's like they don't have the pick protection anymore, but they also don't have Zach LaVine. So if you're the Sixers, are you like happy about this for going for the 10th seed? Are you not? But so they still have Nikola Vucevic, obviously. They still have Lonzo Ball. They still have Ayo Dosunmu. They still have Kobe White, all of whom I would be very seriously investigating the trade value of. But I wonder, I mean, Ball is still an expiring contract, of course. Vucevic, I think they're looking for a first for him. I don't think they're going to get it. But now that LaVine has been traded, the financial pressure is off a little bit to also move Vucevic. But if they're just like, okay, we made our move, we're good, we're going to hold on to these guys, kind of the same way as they did in the summer. They're just like, all right, DeRozan, yeah, we're not going to bring it back, whatever. But, we'll go get Josh Giddey and still try to compete this year. Like if it's just this is just one piece of the move and the rest of the stuff doesn't happen and get assets, because, it's not like they're in a good position in their rebuild right now. Like they've just taken themselves out of being in maybe a really terrible position. Like they're still not plus a first. They got Portland's lotto protected first through 2028, but I don't know how much you love that. So they're not one of these teams still that is like +3, +4 first. And maybe if they were to trade some of the guys they have, they could start moving in that direction and you would feel better about their rebuild. Plus, they would also still be improving their 2025 pick, which I think they desperately need to do. So I think there's going to be a lot of signal here in these next 5 days from Chicago is just, have they gotten religion at all out of this? Or is this just simply another piecemeal deck shuffling type of move?
Yeah, and I don't trust the Bulls. I will believe it when I see it. That is the way that I approach things. There are, of course, reasons for that into their history. And speaking of teams I don't trust, the Sacramento Kings. And Sacramento, in terms of the overall asset return here for De'Aaron Fox, remember the part of this, so they got back 2 firsts, San Antonio's own and Minnesota's, and then they picked up that fake first, what I call it, from Charlotte, because Charlotte, it's their 2025, but it's protected 1-14. The Charlotte Hornets are not making the playoffs, and so thus it becomes.
Yeah. It'll be 2 good seconds, though, you would
yes.
think, for Charlotte.
26 and 27, they should be pretty good. Those should be pretty juicy during that time, but they are seconds.
And the Kings were also just like completely out of seconds. So
correct.
And for a team that still is going to need more depth in the front court, getting those back, it could be pretty useful.
So in terms of their overall out, of course, Fox, but they also traded Jordan McLaughlin, and they bring back not only those 2 firsts, and let's call it 2 firsts and 5 seconds as we kind of understand things to be right now, but they also get back Zach LaVine. And so Zach LaVine, depending on your aims, he definitely makes them better. Not better than they were with Fox necessarily, but better than they were if they were trading Fox for more like the package I negotiated in our little mock Fox situation. And so now they have a very Bullsy core of Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan, and Domantas Sabonis playing the Nikola Vucevic
Can we
role.
just stop for a second to appreciate how ridiculous this last 9 months of events has been with these Bulls, Kings, Spurs trades.
Well, yeah, and briefly, like these three teams have now made two completely distinct 3-team trades during this league year, basically. Yeah, it is this league year because DeRozan happened after. And it's wild. I thought about, like, because of that, I'm like, oh, it'd be so funny if the Bulls brought back Harrison Barnes in this when that was the reason they didn't get the swap in the first place, all that type of stuff. And so, yeah, the Kings, I mean, presumably they're going to, I mean, we know that DeRozan, Levine, and Sabonis are going to start unless one of those guys, which would be DeRozan, gets moved. I guess you're doing a Monk DeRozan or Monk Levine backcourt and then having Keegan Murray is the other starter, but you can do some variants. You can play a lot of stuff out there. I do truly love the Monk Sabonis chemistry. And so for Sacramento, I mean, I guess I want to start with you. How good are they?
Well, yeah, I want to hit on that for a second. I did realize, though, that we probably should have spent a little more time for Chicago on just the fact that they had to take back Zach Collins' contract and Herter, who also is, Herter is a guy who's maybe been a fourth guard since he had that breakout 23 at best. And maybe he can play better in Chicago and he'll fit right into them just wanting to bomb a bunch of threes. But Zach Collins had completely fallen out of the rotation. He's got $18 million for next year. He can walk right down the street to Mark Barstein's office. And same thing with her. So that's $35 million. I mean, if you want to say that there's probably, $10 million worth of value there to just take on $25 million in dead money to only get back your pick and to move on from a guy who maybe was a little overpaid this year and might again be in the future. But that is something to consider too. Now,
sure,
perhaps that is a good indication that the Chicago Bulls will not really be trying to win that much next year, which would be a good thing. So that, maybe they think Zach Collins and Herter can play a little bit. Maybe Herter is someone who could be reflipped, or at least could be I mean, they have a bunch of expiring contracts too. That's the other thing for Chicago is now in 26-27, they could have basically an entire roster's worth of cap space. Their only double-digit salary at that point is Patrick Williams. And now Josh Giddey is going to be a restricted free agent this offseason. But if they wanted to move on from Josh Giddey, they could have $25 million in space this offseason too.
One more Bulls thing we forgot.
Yeah.
Mock deadline predicts all. They currently have too many players on their roster. We'll have to see how that
yeah, I think they can probably
it won't be a problem. But
go ahead.
It just cracked me up that it's them when we had this whole thing where they had, at one point in the mock had 20. But let's get to the
here's an interesting question for you, Danny. How we traded Zach LaVine. What was the LaVine trade in the mock with the Lakers?
I just closed that tab.
I can't believe we didn't have him with getting Luka Doncic in that. They had to settle for Zach LaVine and Walker Kessler.
Okay,
that was actually pretty good.
Okay, so that trade was LaVine, Torrey Craig, and then a pick swap going from the Bulls to the Lakers for Rui Hachimura, Gabe Vincent, Jared Vanderbilt, Hood Schifino, Christian Wood, and one Lakers unprotected first, the 29 one, the Luka first.
Yeah, so I think the Bulls probably did about the same there. Like they got better salary back from the Lakers, getting their own pick back in this period. I would say is probably equivalent to getting that unprotected 2029 Lakers first. They did have to do like a reverse swap as well, which was some value going back. But yeah, I think this was about right for Zach LaVine, just given the possibility that he was going to regress and the injury issues and his age and just how much he was making 30% of the cap or so. So, all right, back to your question about Sacramento, which was how good are the Kings now? And actually, can I look at the asset component of it first?
Of course.
I actually think that might matter more. I would say the Kings did pretty well here within the realm of what they were trying to accomplish, but also that I don't know that they could have done much better in terms of the asset play anyway, because of all the factors we talked about in the Fox mock trade and that John and I talked about the other day, which is Fox wants to be in San Antonio, and how many other teams would have beaten this San Antonio offer just in terms of assets. And I'm not even talking about LaVine yet, but just in terms of assets. how many teams would have beaten that? I don't think many would have. I think, two or one really good first, one that's not that great, and then the 5 seconds with Fox not willing to say that he's going to re-sign there, which San Antonio thinks they could rely on. Would Miami have beaten that offer and just hoped that Fox would have wanted to stay there? Possibly. Houston, I think, just wasn't interested in him, which was another obvious suitor. And if the Lakers wanted him, I don't think they're going to be too interested now. Although, if the Lakers were willing to offer like 2031 and Connect and anything else that wasn't tied down for Fox, that would it all just wouldn't have worked in the salary structure anyway. So part of the problem was the Kings didn't really have any other suitors to begin with, and then those suitors, even had they existed, would have had their offers depressed by the fact that Fox wasn't necessarily going to commit to staying there as he would in San Antonio. So really the Kings were almost having to just rely on internal leverage, and the reporting indicated that they were the ones who started these discussions, although that is kind of a distinction without a difference because it all came down to Fox not saying he's not going to extend. So given all of those constraints, I think in terms of the assets, they did maybe slightly worse than you would have hoped. They didn't get any of these players back from San Antonio. I didn't think those players were that good. But I think they actually did better to go the draft pick direction, especially for what they need. And I like that they went for a 2031 pick, even though they're kind of in win now mode. They could, of course, trade that pick too. We'll see. And that could be another part of this, is that they could try to make another move or a couple of moves with the seconds and the first that they got. But then to also get back Zach LaVine. There wasn't who is going to really help them. And this is a group that, for better or for worse, they put this together with Sabonis and obviously DeRozan and LaVine. And they still they're out this pick going forward to that they would probably love to get off their books to Atlanta from the Herter deal. So I actually think that this is pretty good for Sacramento to just take this era to its logical conclusion. You might make the playoffs a couple of years, which is, it's worth something. That's when you have Sabonis as your big star, that is always going to be your ceiling anyway. So this furthers those aims. Maybe even if things kind of break up, you could look to move on from LaVine at a later point if it's really not working, or he could become an expiring contract in the end. And this era kind of actually has a more logical expiration date than it would have if you had re-signed Fox to a big deal. So you spend a couple of years going after it with these guys, maybe 3, and then, all right, it kind of doesn't work out, and then you could rebuild, and that actually kind of all makes sense now. And there was no other deal out there other than this 3-team construction, with San Antonio having the Bulls pick and that having a unique value to the Bulls, to get back a player who could actually play and get assets. So I think this is pretty good for the Kings when you consider really where they were to begin with.
It's a good framing. And I think that it's also important to note that generally the assets that went to the Bulls were on the softer side. So it's not like we think that they gave up a ton additionally in this deal to get Zach LaVine, because, they kept most of the picks. The only thing Chicago got draft wise was that. And Sacramento was able to not only get off some of their own negative salary, but were able to get off some negative salary that was going to come to them as salary matching in the trade. So I agree with you. I agree with you on that front. And the idea that this allows the Kings to see it's kind of to its natural conclusion. Sure. However, I don't trust the Kings, and I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the case. By the way, this is Zach LaVine finally getting back to the Kings. They're the ones who made that offer sheet on him those many years ago when Vlade was running the team.
Yeah. Which we thought was insane, and actually wasn't that bad in the end.
Yeah, it worked out. And so LaVine, this contract covers his age 29 season, 30 is next year, and then the player option is his age 31. I'm more than a little concerned that Sacramento, if this time goes relatively well, that they will give him a mistake contract there. And DeRozan's going to be too old, and so maybe they overcommit to a thing that's already going to be dead but maybe not. And they already have Monk on a reasonable contract. Keegan Murray will be restricted in 26, so maybe they can figure this stuff out. And so I think that there is an element that is somewhat similar to the trade that we talked about on Saturday night, which is if Sacramento wasn't going to go down this other path, if they weren't going to, move everything they had for assets and really tear this thing down.
And honestly, I think Sabonis has way more value to them than anybody else. I think if they put Sabonis on the market, I don't think there would be really much of a return. I think there would be very limited suitors, and teams would not love that contract.
I broadly agree. However, we've seen players like this. I mean, Vooch is a fantastic example. We've seen it only takes one or two, and Sabonis produces. I mean, he produces at a high level. We get into all that. So, but it would have taken a lot. And I think if they had wanted to, they could have gotten off DeRozan. His contract is very reasonable, all that. And then you could still keep Monk and Murray. And if you want to, you could keep all those guys together. So if the path not taken is unrealistic, I will acknowledge fully that is unrealistic, then LaVine, he's a good player. His contract is, I think it has some real downside risk, but it's not horrendous. It doesn't go out 5 years or anything like that. And LaVine, Sabonis, DeRozan, that's, it's a cromulent foundation if your goal is to be a middle of the road team. And I think that's what Sacramento is probably going to be. So yeah, it's fine. And it'll be hard for them potentially to pivot in 25 or in 26, but they weren't going to anyway. So it's that part of it is, and I brought this up before that my theory has been that the Kings will miss De'Aaron Fox less than some anticipate. And that was in the idea that they weren't getting back.
Yeah. Particularly once they got LaVine. Yeah. I mean, that's, LaVine and Malik Monk are a very interesting fit.
They are
together also.
Yeah, I think there's a meaningful chance the Kings are better for the rest of this year than they would have been with Fox.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more, because I do think one of the big reasons why the Kings haven't been as effective is that handoff game with Sabonis has suffered just from having worse shooting. Keegan Murray hasn't been the same shooter. Herter was so deadly there. It seems like the Warriors playoff series where he was so bad was his kryptonite. He's kind of never really been the same anymore. And so without those guys, now LaVine is he is great to play that handoff game with Sabonis. LaVine played it well with Vucevic, and Sabonis is way better than that. And Sabonis then can roll to the basket and finish, or make another pass if you double team LaVine coming off these screens. LaVine is still one of the fastest guys in a straight line in the league, so his back cutting should look really good as well, playing with Sabonis. And then they still have Monk, and they still have DeRozan as well. I don't know if they would even consider moving Malik Monk for some more size and toughness. We've seen LaVine and DeRozan be okay together. Maybe it's kind of your turn, my turn, but at least LaVine can shoot. He's having a great shooting season.
He is.
And I mean, I think they're going to ask him to do even more 3-point shooting than he was before. And then I think they surely will get into the market and solidify that backup front court, at least to some degree. So, and then, they still have Devin Carter coming in as well. Keon Ellis is someone who can guard the ball. Maybe because they got LaVine, they might even consider moving Ellis. So they have ways to get this team into maybe being a team that could look like a top 6 playoff team. Of course, they also made the Spurs way better as well, which is going to be some more competition. But Dallas, who knows what they're going to look like? Who knows what the Lakers are going to look like now with all these trades? So maybe the Kings could start hitting the gas pedal again and get at least into that top half of the play-in bracket and be difficult to deal with. So they take a big downgrade defensively. That's probably your biggest issue, is that Fox, even if he wasn't playing at 100% intensity all year, he still could be a quality defensive option, and LaVine is just not going to be that. So they may reach a tipping point if you're starting LaVine instead of Fox, DeRozan, Sabonis, and Monk is only okay. He again has gotten better in Sacramento than he's been previously. That's
Yeah, I mean,
it's going to be maybe a little ugly, but their offense should be better. Their transition game should be better now too. Well, I don't know if that's true. Fox could still push it, so that's probably not the case actually. But
it's a dangerous game to have one above average defensive player and it's not your center. So there could very well be some risks there, but they have some other lineups. And as you said, I mean, if their bench defense can get better, which doesn't happen in this trade, but maybe this opens the door for that to happen in something else, which it probably would have anyway, that could potentially be useful for the Kings. And I mean, it is hilarious that the West, I mean, there's been a lot of reshuffling with the Lakers and the Mavericks, but also you have two teams are here with the Kings and the Spurs getting better, getting more talented, who are kind of on the periphery of this race. And we don't know if they're going to replace anybody, much less who that would be. But for the West playoff, play-in mix to get even stronger in net is hilarious.
Tim says, am I crazy to think the Kings are a Butler team now? I would certainly be investigating that if I were them.
I would be investigating it, but the problem is the math, the salary math, because they, assuming Levine, Sabonis, and DeRozan are not a part of the deal, I guess DeRozan would be potentially. So if you do DeRozan,
DeRozan would obviously he would be the centerpiece.
So it'd be DeRozan and probably, I mean, it wouldn't have to be Monk. You could get there a couple different ways.
Yeah, it might. You're probably at the point where it'd have to be. I mean, now that you've lost Herter. So and they actually have 11 million below the tax nowadays.
They do.
So that actually does give them some more room. They just got to get to 80% of Butler's number, which is 48. So that actually wouldn't be. So his number is 48. So you get to 80% of that. So
CFT, which is 39.
40. Yeah. So that would be. Yeah, I mean they're still running out of ammo fast. In that regard, I mean, obviously, if you did DeRozan and Monk, you could get there. If you made it DeRozan and Lyles, that's only 31, and then then you've got Devin Carter and minimums. Essentially, then you get into these issues of like all the roster spots and stuff to get up there enough. But yeah, they could take on if they could just get to 39, they could get Butler and stay below the tax potentially. Now. We'll talk more about Butler and some of the reporting around him with Golden State. We still got some news to get to here. Let's see if there's any other comments that we can hit on.
Well, so briefly, Nate, we kind of folded with comments, but so we've talked about it before with some of the other teams. With Sacramento, would you have done this deal?
Yeah, knowing that Fox wasn't going to re-sign, yeah, I think they did well here, and that there was only one place that he was going to go. I didn't value those Spurs players as much as they may have. The Spurs may have, certainly. Like I thought if they're to make, I was more interested, like getting that Minnesota first in 2031 is pretty good. And getting back Levine is just someone that they need. Now, should I push harder for like Castle, as I was talking about, like doesn't really fit in with this era of the team right now. And Vassell probably would, but San Antonio probably really valued him. He may not have been available. So, and I think, to accomplish their goal of getting some assets and hopefully not really being that much worse while trading someone like De'Aaron Fox, I think that's fine. And you do also, do also avoid having to give Fox that contract. Mm-hmm. Like that's, I don't know how meaningless that is. Like, I think De'Aaron Fox is on a better contract than Zach LaVine right now, but Zach LaVine, is possibly expiring at the same time that De'Aaron Fox would have needed 30% of the cap. Sammy says, how is this not really bad value for the Bulls? They took on terrible salary and only got a pick that if they tanked right would have never conveyed. I
mean, they only took on bad salary for 1 year, and they weren't. Yeah. They weren't. Yeah,
they did get off of LaVine, which I think was important to do it at the point when they still could.
Yeah, even with those guys, they still saved a fair amount of money for 25-26 and all of it for 26-27. And I don't think that having that money on their books for 25-26 is that bad for Chicago. Oh, they were going to use cap space in a year that like very few guys are free agents. And, and if they really needed to, they could stretch these dudes. If for whatever reason, player X wanted to go to the Bulls and was available, they could make it work. This isn't going to be that much of an impediment if it doesn't have to be, if you need something.
Well, to Sammy's point here, I think number one, they knew and far be it for me to defend the Chicago Bulls management, but I'm sure they had an idea after a year and a half of trade discussions of what the best offers were out there for LaVine. And I'm guessing they haven't found one that they're willing to take up until now. So I'm guessing that they probably were like, wow, these offers have been awful. We finally got something we're willing to do. Let's jump on it. And when you say if they had tanked properly, well, Zach LaVine was part of the reason that they were having a little trouble tanking properly, quite frankly. They kind of needed to get him off the team if they wanted to go that route. So you might say, well, yeah, all they got back was this pick that they were going to, if they tanked right, they would have kept it anyway. But like, that's kind of hard to do when you have Zach. He's actually been pretty decent. And they really wanted to move him. They finally found a way to do it and get some value. I do agree with Sammy that if I were Chicago, would I have wanted to get maybe something else instead? Because that pick is still kind of within my control. I could move LaVine, get something else, and like I wouldn't have valued that as much. And that's my fear, is that they are valuing the ability to now, oh, thank God we can now chase the 10th seed again. Like if that's what ends up happening, I share his concerns, to be sure. I assume Sammy is a guy. But like that's I don't like it as much, I think, for the Bulls as some for that reason.
Nate asks, do you think Vooch and White are on the move now? I don't think that's definitive for either guy, much less both. I think it's more likely with Vucevic than for Kobe White because you could just keep Kobe White, and I think the Bulls kind of want to. But especially with getting their picks back, I am not certain that this is an overall sea change rather than just moving LaVine.
Kyle says, couldn't Sack have done better waiting until the summer?
No, because
maybe no.
Because unless he changed his list or something else like that, because you're getting him for 1 year, 1 playoffs, and it's just hard to see teams fall over themselves for that.
Yeah, San Antonio might have had even more leverage in the summer, and the way it seemed like since these latest articles came out about Fox or the Kings trying to move Fox, or Fox wasn't going to resign or whatever, they started to play pretty poorly. I think it was really starting to fuck up the team pretty badly. Fox, would have been all the way checked out too if you held on. So being able to win this year was part of this, which that matters some, and to be able to get LaVine for that period and reset, I think was important. And I don't know that the deal. And Chicago also, let's say they do keep the pick for next year or for 2025. Or what if they actually end up conveying it? And now San Antonio doesn't have that thing that Chicago really wants that lets you get Zach LaVine. I think maybe there's some possibility they could have done a little better, but I think this is a deal that was a good deal for them when you're presented with that you feel comfortable with now. I think there's no guarantee it could have been better. Maybe it could have been better in the summer. Maybe not. I think probably more likely not, because of the fact that he's under contract for only a year, as you mentioned, instead of a year and a half. So no, I don't know that there would have been a better deal. And I also think that this one was fine.
Oh, and briefly, we got a question about why didn't the Spurs just trade for LaVine if this is the cost? And for me, the answer is because Zach LaVine, there's no real plausible argument that he makes sense with Wembanyama's timeline. LaVine is already 29. He's 2 years older than Fox. He's a good player, but you get into that. And so, yeah, if you could get him for nothing or close to nothing, then maybe you consider it. But
Fox Fox is just way better than LaVine too. I would say, especially because of the defense, and Fox is a better passer than LaVine too. It's an interesting concept, I think.
Well, and Nate, with this structure, with this construction of the deal for Fox, they actually could have theoretically just done both parts of this. They could have, depending on how interested Chicago was in San Antonio's other dudes, they could have brought in both Fox and LaVine. But I don't know that they wanted to do that.
Okay. Should we get to some other news here?
Yeah, I mean, we might as well start with the other trade. It's obviously not as sizzly as this one, the one that happened on Saturday that we didn't discuss, which is the Clippers trading PJ Tucker, Mo Bamba, who has already been waived, and their own 2025 second round pick to the Utah Jazz in exchange for Drew Eubanks and Patty Mills. And so for the Clippers, this does two big things. One of them is this gets them out of the luxury tax. We had, talked about how Bones Highland could be a way to do that, but they got off of Tucker and Bamba. Eubanks makes a lot less. The second is that it gives them an option at backup center. They're trading functionally Mo Bamba for Drew Eubanks. And neither one of those guys has been particularly good this year. I would prefer to have Eubanks. I think there's a better chance that he is passable and fits in kind of more in what the Clippers have in Zubats than Mo Bamba does. So you can roll those dice. And so for the Clippers, I think it's a nice work by them to upgrade and save at the cost of their own second in 25, which is fine but not great.
Yeah, I thought this was pretty good value for LA to be able to trade someone making $11 million. Now, it was interesting that the Jazz got 2 seconds just for taking Hood Schifino in the other deal, and they're about the same type of level as that Clippers one. So the Jazz didn't preclude themselves from being able to do that, of course, in this one. And I'm sure that the cash involved was pretty substantial. You can send out up to $7 million or more in cash. I think it's like 7.4 is the limit this year. So, and Mills actually, like, maybe you could give them a little something. I'm guessing probably not, but they of course needed a backup center. So this is a very good piece of business for the Clippers for just a second and cash to get at least a reasonable backup center who can also protect the rim. Mo Bamba, it just has never been that healthy and has never been that effective. They also can always go with Batum at center if they want to, but they needed a center with a pulse, and this is a group that actually like has some aspirations this year. Would I have liked to have someone who could shoot at the 5? Sure, but they don't have, of course, the assets to go get that player. So they accomplished all of their goals here, and a very good piece of business for them. I was surprised that they're able to do it for as little as it was. You would have thought maybe this sort of deal would have required another second, but Eubanks is kind of, maybe a minus backup center is how, is he the 45th best center, 50th best center, maybe even a little lower than that.
And something I think the Clippers probably like about this structure is that also Eubanks has a non-guarantee for next year at the league-wide cutdown date. So it's $4.8 million. So they can go into the offseason and say, like, can we get a better backup center? The Kings are, or sorry, not the Kings, the Clippers are, they should have a little bit of wiggle room under the tax. It depends on Amir Coffey. But they might be able to do better. And if they can do better, then you just cut the dude. And if you can't do better, then you keep him. And the other kind of thing that I found a little interesting about this deal is that Bones Highland could have been a flyer of sorts for the Utah Jazz. Like the salary saving that I thought the Clippers were going to do, but the roster spots were an issue. And I don't think Bones Highland has that much intrigue where he would get a ton of minutes over the myriad young guards that Utah already has.
Yeah, I think Will Hardy, the Jazz want him to remain their coach, and it's probably a good idea to not acquire Bones Highland for that reason. This one is massive, actually, and it's not a trade, but it's something that, again, is going to have big-time ripple effects as the star-crossed New Orleans Pelicans suffered another devastating injury. It's Dejounte Murray tried to react to a rebound and reach back with that right foot to push off, and we saw the thing that we've seen devastate people so many times, and you knew pretty much right away that it was in fact a torn Achilles. We haven't seen anyone return from that in less than a year, and then of course how well would he play after that? So you basically, if you're building the New Orleans Pelicans, you gave up so much for him as well, right? You gave up that second of Milwaukee and New Orleans in 27. You gave up Dyson Daniels. You gave up the Lakers pick unprotected this year to go get him. And now You thought you had things solved at point guard. He breaks his hand. He comes back. He plays really badly. He was starting to look a little bit better in the last few weeks. And then this happens, and basically you can't count him for another 2 years. And then what kind of a player will he be at that point? Also, incidentally, for Dejounte Murray, good job going and getting your extension that everyone said, oh, it's not really that much for him. It's like, well, that's why you still get it. And you still have hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank, even when you tear your Achilles. But this is, I mean, how does this affect what New Orleans is planning to do, who are already one of the weirder franchises in the league with all the variables that they're dealing with at the moment?
It's devastating for Murray, first of all. I mean, to lose this year, and as you said, probably a significant portion of next, but it's similar for the Pelicans because this year is lost in terms of like playoff relevance and all that. But next year, if they were getting, we don't know who exactly they would have brought back, but I mean, they're going to have Herb Jones in all likelihood, and they were going to, they have a fairly talented roster, and we'll see what Zion they were presumably going to have. But now you have to fill a Dejounte Murray-sized hole in your rotation, but they don't have the salary flexibility to functionally replace him. There's still the Brandon Ingram questions. And so it presents a totally different challenge for David Griffin. And I think that the focal point here, a useful one, is CJ McCollum, because there is a totally justifiable rationale that is, well, shit, we can't trade him now. CJ is going to be important to running our offense, and Dejounte Murray, like without Dejounte Murray, if we're going to try to stay afloat, we do all this stuff. And I think that's right. But if the idea is like, we're kind of burned anyway, could we do something? Could we do something else? Potentially even take another gap year. I don't know how thrilled Zion would be, but you have this weird uncertainty at your forward spots. I think that it leads them to kind of keeping CJ and try to see how good you can be. And maybe you get Dejounte Murray back for the end of next year and ideally a playoff run. But oh boy, is this hard.
Yeah, and certainly you wouldn't want to rely on him even coming back those last 2 months. And you could even see them just holding him out again. So he's Dejounte 31.5 for next year, then 33.5. And then player option goes down to 31. Remember, he got bumped up due to the trade bonus when he got sent to New Orleans. So, yeah, part of the reason that you acquired him was you've had stability at that position going forward on a reasonable contract. And then by the time he comes back, he has one guaranteed year left before a possible player option. And to me, this makes it more likely that, maybe not more likely, but clearer to me in terms of if I were running the Pels, that it's really time to just hit the reset button on this entire Williamson Ingram era. Your thought would have been, all right, we'll see what happens in the draft now. And this should help their tanking to not have Dejounte Murray, by the way. But we'll see what happens in the draft here. And then maybe we re-sign Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson. We still got Dejounte Murray. We got Herb Jones. We got Trey Murphy. We'll move CJ in the offseason, but still try to pick up a guy who can play. We got Yves Missi now. Maybe we trade CJ for a center who's making less. And, hey, we got a pretty good team. And we got another bite at the apple with a really good prospect in the draft. And now we're ready to go. We're just going to kind of pick up where we left off. Now that really has become, I would say, unrealistic. And, yes, they could hold on to CJ because they just need a point, but they still have this financial problem, right? You still can't bring back Brandon Ingram. And to me, this makes it much more likely that Ingram is traded. Like we talked about, well, if you don't get a certain amount for him, you might as well just wait and see what happens with his bird rights in the offseason. But if you also now are going to have $31 million in dead money on your books and no point guard for next year, and you also it's going to be much harder to create the space to bring back Ingram when you have that 31 million in dead money on your books. Then I think if I'm New Orleans, it makes more sense to just move Ingram now for whatever, because re-signing him isn't that palatable to me, because you're probably not really going to win anyway next year. But again, I could understand them wanting to just see what their team looks like when they get this draft pick in this offseason. So adds to the uncertainty. I don't know if it changes their thinking. I think it would probably change my thinking a little bit.
You and I are in line on this. We often are. And my instinct is that David Griffin is not. And we'll know more in about 5 days. But I think that their idea will be like, we'll need to try to keep it together, not to fully rock the boat. And I mean, we'll have to see, but I feel so badly for Dejounte Murray, who's, dealt with multiple significant injuries now. And, I was really excited to see the Pelicans next year. This year sucked, but to see next year, and now we may never get the opportunity to see it. And it could lead to a brighter overall outcome. Maybe this leads them to finding religion, but I don't know that just yet.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's more point Zion. Maybe Zion and Ingram can go back to being the ball handlers at this point. And Trey Murphy also has been going off lately as well. That might be another reason why you feel like you can continue building. Then, of course, the question that John and I talked about a couple weeks ago is, could this finally be the end for David Griffin? It's not necessarily his fault that Dejounte Murray, who'd been relatively healthy, tore his Achilles. Although, I mean, Murray has had that torn ACL in his career too, and to his credit, came back really well. The Achilles at this age might be harder, but yeah, David Griffin, possibly Willie Green. Like, how does this affect management's evaluation of them? Does this torn Achilles just make him be able to say, yeah, you know what, this is just a year from hell, give us another chance? Like, does it buy him more time? Or if you're management, you're like, yeah, you know what, we kind of want someone else making this draft pick this season. Let's see here. Oh, yeah, just want to remind everyone to give us a like and subscribe. We would very much appreciate that. We'll be doing more of these. We'll do at least the first half of the trade deadline here on YouTube. And if you want to get all of our work, of course, subscribe to Dunc'd On Prime, including you can get every Hollinger and Duncan as well. And on this channel, we also have a number of Hollinger and Duncan episodes. So we appreciate y'all support, and that like and subscribe to help grow the channel would be much appreciated. Where are we going next here?
I think we should catch up on what we've found out about the mega deal on Saturday with Luka Doncic going to the Lakers. And there was a press conference Nico Harrison gave in Dallas. I would say an awkward press conference, I think, is probably.
It might have been in Cleveland. I think. It was
oh yeah, you're right. You're right.
For accuracy's sake.
Yeah, before they got completely demolished, shorthanded, of course, by the
Cowboys. Yeah, they're on another planet after that game. They just got blown out of the gym.
By the way, the Cavs clean the glass net rating went up more than half a point this deep in the season by that margin, and I'm sure that has a garbage.
And that's supposed to exclude garbage time, but clean the glass doesn't completely eliminate any.
You mean when it doesn't say when the first quarter is 50-19? Like, okay, the rest of this is garbage time. But what did you think was most telling from Nico Harrison's availability?
Yeah, he had a few things, and again, I focused on this yesterday with the idea that Luka's contract was ending. As I think about it more and hearing some more of the reporting, I think it may have been more affecting the direction they decided to go in terms of what they traded for, rather than the decision to move on for him. They focused, at least initially in leaks, on they didn't want to give him the Supermax. To me, we went through why we thought all of that was specious. Everyone has been saying Luka never wanted to leave. He said that on social media. Harrison did say, however, this was his quote, "There's some unique things about his contract that we had to pay attention to. There's other teams that were loading up that he was going to be able to decide, make his own decision at some point of whether he wants to be here or not, whether we want to Supermax him or not, or whether he wants to opt out. So I think we had to take all that into consideration, and I feel like we got out in front of what could have been a tumultuous summer."
Really? I mean, is the tumult that we haven't really seen guys, you offer the 35% max, which we would have had to wait, which he now has to, till after his 10th season. We haven't seen players turn that down. There could have been a tumultuous.
Well, that's not true. No, we have. I mean, Kawhi, he was technically never offered it, but that's because he didn't want to be there. He would have gotten that if he had wanted to be there. AD would have gotten that as well. There are guys who, at this time, with the time that it would have been with 1 year left on the deal, there are guys who have decided they wanted to be elsewhere rather than signing that. Like that's not
Okay,
out of the
I'll
realm of
acknowledge.
possibility. There's no indication that Luka was in that category.
Right. And so it seems to me like this is more the Mavericks being uncomfortable offering it. And a player who's 25, turning 26, who has been as good as Luka Doncic is, you make that offer. And if he doesn't accept it, then you probably have to move on and everything like that. But without an indication that Luka was not going to accept it. And what I was thinking about in terms of this, in terms of the tumultuous and all that is, I was lingering on this idea that if you sign a player to a designated veteran extension, you cannot trade them for a year. You cannot trade them for that league year. So if you really wanted to be out of the Luka Doncic business, even if you thought that you could recoup that value in time, you still have to have him until if you make and he accepts that extension, you still have to have him until June of 2026. And if you don't want that, that might be untenable, even though I think it should be very tenable.
The other thing that came out, I think this was already apparent from the reporting last night, so we probably alluded to it already, but was that he did really only he said he only talked to one other team. Sam Amick did say that there was some discussion with one other team. He was unable to name that team. We'll see if more comes out in that respect.
I really want to know who that other team is.
Yes. So the Thunder with Shea. I mean, it must have been someone where just that team would have never thought about it. Like, it could be the Thunder with Shea. Who knows? But in any event, I think that is not surprising. And I went through yesterday my feeling of why it was that they ended up with this package. But I think, and everyone was marveling, oh, they managed to keep it quiet. They managed to keep it quiet. It was all between Nico and then Mavs ownership and Lakers ownership and Pelinka, and no one else knew about it and was the wiser. Then what the fuck do you have a front office for? like okay, so you can scout guys in the draft or whatever, sure. But and yes, there is a need to kind of keep this stuff quiet if it's really necessary, which I don't think it was. But the reason you have this and you have a process is so that when you want to do something stupid, everyone else in your front office can tell you how stupid you're being, and then you don't do it. That's why you have the process.
Yeah, you don't just talk to an old friend and just say, "Oh, is this good?"
Yeah, like the I trust Rob Pelinka because like I worked closely with Kobe when Rob was Kobe's agent. Like, and I knew I could trust him, and that's why we're going to make the trade with them. Obviously, I explained yesterday again why if there was win now, Anthony Davis was the best player that they could acquire. I'm a little more sympathetic to them with respect to that one issue, though obviously I hate the trade nearly as much as everyone else does. But that's the downside of secrecy is you don't actually get the wisdom of crowds, and you can just end up in your own head when you have a crazy opinion that like now groupthink can result from that too. It's not like sometimes it's better to have only one person, but like this was one where maybe having more people involved would have, or at least maybe you get the 2031 pick, like that.
Well,
it's like, yeah, if we're going to do this, like, let's actually get everything they have.
Well, and Nate, speaking of other voices in the room, this is also a consequence of the Mavericks being sold to someone who isn't Mark Cuban, who don't seem to be as
Mark Cuban would have never done this.
Would have never done this, but also would have been engaged enough from a basketball perspective that Harrison wouldn't have had the latitude. It would have been at least been another voice in the room. And it appears that the Adelsons are not another voice in this room. They're just there. And so it's a deal that saves the money. It's like if you think it's good, then you're all good. And so it's remarkable. And I mean, it's these next 2 years. And I know that so there was a quote from Harrison about how Anthony Davis fits their time frame, and the future to him is.
Can I read that whole thing?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. He fits our time frame, Harrison said. If you pair him with Kyrie and the rest of the guys, he fits right along with our time frame to win now and win in the future. And the future to me is 3-4 years from now. The future 10 years from now, I don't know. They'll probably bury me and J Kidd by then, or we'll bury ourselves. I did kind of find this refreshing in some ways, but this is the closest I think any GM has ever come to admitting the moral hazard. And you can go back to the 2030 picks that they traded away, and 2027 and 2028, and all the stuff that they've done future focused. I thought that was like, well, shit, they could lose Luka Doncic here. They better get themselves to be good. But I thought it was fascinating to see Harrison. I mean, he may have just been bloviating in a way to try to explain the trade and just tripping all over himself. But I don't recall a GM ever talking like that before.
No, he didn't bring up the heat death of the universe, but he did. It is a pretty remarkable thing for somebody to say, especially on a trade that is so present focused for a team that has these future obligations and everything else. And I'm still completely gobsmacked. I woke up this morning and looked at my phone and just made sure that it did actually happen. Like that's how wild this was. And this kind of trade doesn't happen. And I mean, and we'll be processing the ramifications of this for not just for years to come, honestly, probably for decades to come.
Lazarus suggested maybe it was Giannis that they.
I think it might have been Wembanyama.
Yeah. But we, as you'll recall, for those who listened on Dunc'd On Prime yesterday, I went through the list of basically every top 30 player in the league. And the issue was you still had to be sending Luka somewhere where he would have wanted to stay, or you weren't going to get anything. And I think, him staying in Milwaukee seems like it would have been, pretty unlikely. What else we got here?
I don't think we have as much that's quite as impactful as all this. I mean, I will note while we're still on the Luka Doncic front that two kind of interesting things. One is that both of the key players in this deal are hurt. Luka with the calf strain, he might be back in about a week. And then Anthony Davis has an ab strain. He should be back relatively soon as well. But they are both hurt right now. And Maxi Kleber, another player in this deal, also hurt. And then we also got a little bit of reporting from Chris Haynes that LeBron intends to stay on the Lakers through the deadline. And that matters because LeBron James has a no trade clause. So if he intends to stay there, then he probably actually does.
Yeah. Although Sam did mention the possibility that maybe he could move on. I think it would make sense, certainly, for the Lakers to explore it, just because getting assets that match up more with Luka's timeline than 40-year-old LeBron James would make sense to me, to at least gauge that. Now, if it's like, yeah, the Warriors will give you a first, so they'll just give you Jonathan Kuminga and expiring contract or something, yeah, obviously you hold on to LeBron. But if there's a way to get some significant assets, but also get guys who will fit in, I would be thinking about Austin Reeves as well, particularly given his future contract situation. Let's see here. What else do we have?
And also on the Lakers, Gabe Vincent returned on Saturday. He'd missed 3 straight with a sore left knee. Good to see him back. And then just briefly, Zach LaVine had missed 2 games. He'd missed some games for personal reasons. He was supposed to come back on Sunday and then was scratched. I have a theory for why he was scratched on Sunday.
Yeah. It would seem that that was a good reason to scratch him. Let's see here. We've got OG Anunoby in that game against the Knicks. Brian Sutter had a nice video on it that he sprained his foot. There's a little concern maybe that it could be a Liz Frank. He's supposed to be questionable for the next game, although recall that there was this huge saga with him in the elbow last year. But it doesn't seem at least like it's going to be a season ender for OG Anunoby, which with that mechanism, you did have some concern about that maybe surgery would be required. So that's really good because obviously OG has been leading the league in minutes. You look at the table for the league leaders in minutes, it's all guys in the Knicks starting lineup. So it's good to see that he at least hasn't suffered what will be a significant injury. I don't know if he's going to play in the next game necessarily. And Mitchell Robinson apparently is pretty close, according to Tibbs, to being fully cleared for contact and practicing. Of course, that again could be something that's just related to trying to move him during the trade deadline. I will believe that he's back on the court and playing well for the Knicks when I see it and not before.
Agreed. A couple of returns that are of note. Karis LeVert had missed 7 games due to a wrist issue. He played in their blowout win over the Mavericks on Sunday. Malcolm Brogdon had missed 14 straight due to plantar fasciitis in his right foot. He returned as the Washington Wizards actually beat. Yes, they ended their losing streak against the Minnesota Timberwolves in Minnesota on Saturday. The most shocking.
Somebody played a basketball game on Saturday.
The most shocking thing that happened on Saturday, of course, the Wizards winning. And that win was without Alex Sarr. He's now missed 4 straight, or he will miss his 4th straight on Monday. He has an ankle sprain.
Yeah, Kyle Kuzma's been playing a little bit better, by the way. He had 31 in that one on pretty good efficiency.
I did a bunch of prep on him for the 15 and 60. We will cover that at some point.
Okay.
Emmanuel quickly also back. He hadn't played since January 11th. He had been dealing with this hip issue. He came back Friday, and the surging Toronto Raptors lost to the Chicago Bulls. More on them without LaVine. And I think that's all in terms of returns. The absence that I'm most keeping an eye on is actually Russell Westbrook. So Westbrook left Saturday's game, which was a narrow win for the Nuggets over the Charlotte Hornets, with a hamstring issue. Denver reportedly is calling it a hamstring strain, so this could be an extended absence. Westbrook has, of course, been starting a lot. He's been starting and playing a huge role in Denver's success recently.
Yeah, Aaron Gordon back in the starting lineup. That had relegated Christian Braun to the bench. I do think they're better off with Braun than Westbrook. Braun, not a great shooter, but I think he's still better than Westbrook. And with Murray starting to play well again, I would want that to be the starting group. You can always bring Westbrook off the bench, and then if he's playing particularly well, you could close with him. But I don't think that having Westbrook be default in the starting lineup and that large of a portion of the offense, although he is on pace for his best true shooting percentage in his entire career. In Jokic, we trust. And then this is one we probably haven't talked about enough, that Cam Thomas strained his left hamstring, came back for a couple days in early January, and then basically been out again with the same thing. And so he is going to be out through the All-Star break. And then Noah Clowney was injured on Monday with a sprained ankle and sat out against Charlotte as they actually throttled the Charlotte Hornets in that one.
Well, no, Clowney's also going to be out through the All-Star break with this with this sprained ankle. So that's more shorthanded for the Brooklyn Nets. Isaiah Stewart was suspended. He got his 6th flagrant foul point. I think Dan was looking into this, that it's the first flagrant foul point suspension since 2016. Incidentally, it also occurred on Isaiah Stewart bobblehead night for the Pistons. But so just a curiosity, of course, there. And if he gets 2 more flagrant foul points, he'll get suspended again. It's that whole dance for those who haven't gone through that story before. The Hornets, Josh Okogie, who was just acquired by the Hornets, he has a hamstring strain. He's going to be out for at least 3 weeks. And then Cody Martin has missed 5 straight with a sports hernia. We don't have a timeline on him.
Yeah, John was thinking maybe that Okogie could be flipped. He is $8 million non-guaranteed for next year, or that Martin could be another low-level target for a team looking for more on-ball defense. But with both of them being hurt, it would seem to reduce the chances of that. And Jalen Suggs with this quad contusion, he had missed 10 games. Again, probably something we didn't talk about enough with the lower back strain. They desperately need his shooting, his defense, everything that he's been providing, because the Magic are in an absolute free fall at the moment. So he's questionable to play against the Warriors Monday, and he had missed 3 straight with the contusion after missing 10 straight, coming back 1 with what had been a back injury. And another report on the Jimmy Butler saga, thankfully relegated to somewhat of the sidelines with everything else that's happened. Brian Windhorst reporting that Jimmy Butler is unwilling to sign an extension with the Warriors, and trade talks to send him to Golden State have ended for now. And my thinking on that is, what would the Warriors have wanted in an extension? They wouldn't have said, oh boy, yeah, Jimmy, absolutely, we would love to sign you to another guaranteed year at over $50 million. That's not what their proposal would have been. Their proposal, I'm guessing, would have been, all right, Jimmy, you've got this $52 million player option. how about you opt out of that and re-sign for $38 million, and we'll give you another guaranteed year that way. And that's where Jimmy is like, no, I'm still a max player. I want to get paid every dollar that I possibly can. I'm not basing that on anything other than just my own brain, but I would guess that that's where things went, because I don't think the Golden State Warriors had any interest in giving Jimmy Butler at age 37 over $50 million.
I agree. I think it's that Jimmy Butler is willing to sign an extension, but not the extension that was theoretically discussed.
So where he ends up, who knows? And again, remember what the matching salary has to be for Jimmy. It's probably going to be Andrew Wiggins. I think it should be Draymond Green. I don't think they're willing to, that Jimmy is enough stature. Well, I'm not going to say it. I think it should be. From a pure basketball perspective, it should be Draymond Green. Is Steph Curry might be really sad to lose Draymond, and there is, of course, some value in having him be a franchise legend who finishes his career in Golden State. And is Jimmy Butler, in his current state and current behavior, the guy that you want to give up Draymond Green for? No. So is that, what about Andrew Wiggins? Andrew Wiggins playing pretty well. He's still a pretty good 3-and-D guy. And maybe the Warriors be like, all right, we would consider that if we can get Jimmy's salary down enough next year and get him for one more year, to where it's like you're not just getting just completely destroyed by his salary. Then maybe it's worth giving up Wiggins to acquire him. But if he's not willing to do that, then it's not worth giving up Wiggins to acquire him. And I think Wiggins actually is a better asset than Jimmy Butler is right now. I don't think the Heat want to give up anything. So, if it would just be Andrew Wiggins straight for Jimmy, now maybe the Heat are like, oh, we don't want that last year of Andrew Wiggins' salary because it goes into the precious 2026 summer. So I don't even know what the price would have been for Jimmy, but it seems like, I don't know if this was like, oh, they had a deal and then Jimmy wouldn't do the extension and that scuttled it, or where it was like Jimmy's like, yeah, I would do the extension with you, and then they start trying to negotiate. I'm not sure what order those things would have happened in, but talks have ended for now. But we still have plenty of time before the deadline, and no other obvious Jimmy suitor from what we can tell. Maybe it's Milwaukee, but Milwaukee's got a lot of work to do in terms of aggregating, getting out of the second apron, etc. Want to remind everyone to please subscribe to Dunc'd On Prime. You can get all of our thoughts on the Luka Doncic deal. Use the code MOCKDeadline25. Link to that is in the show notes. And if you're on YouTube, a like and subscribe, certainly much appreciated. We'll be back. I don't know. Who knows what the schedule is going to be for this week, but we got it 15 and 60 to get to. Yes.
But our live show, we're doing the NBA strategy stream. Hopefully, we don't know who is going to be available to play, but it is going to be Spurs-Grizzlies. That is on Monday at 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific. Will be really fun.
I didn't even think of that. That'd be sick if Fox is actually there.
You could join us on League Pass.
Yeah. Yes, that is true. Yeah, if you're a League Pass subscriber, join us. You click on the game, hit watch, and then there's a option for streams on the lower left-hand side. You click on that, and you do strategy stream. Get to hear us talk about the game live. All right, that is enough promoting ourselves. We'll talk to you all tomorrow at some point.